Montana Territory, 1877. Smoke drifted from a lone chimney pipe atop the abandoned cabin, curling into the vast Montana sky like a question mark against the fading twilight. But the cabin wasn't as empty as folks believed. Its weathered logs held secrets, and Cade Whitman was about to discover the most beautiful one of all. Cade had been riding fence lines on the eastern boundary of the Triple Crown Ranch when he'd seen it, the wisp of smoke from the derelict Kendrick homestead, abandoned 3 winters past after a brutal season took old man Kendrick and left the place to the elements. Nobody had claimed it since. The land was too rough, too remote, nestled against the foothills where the plains surrendered to the mountains. At 25, Cade had already learned the bitter lesson that the frontier offered men like him exactly 2 choices: survive alone or die trying to protect others. He'd buried his parents and younger sister after a raid 5 years earlier, and since then, he'd kept his own counsel and his emotions locked tight beneath his Stetson. Ranching suited him, honest work with minimal conversation, predictable dangers, and no attachments beyond his horse and his rifle. Probably just some drifter, he muttered to his dun-gelding copper as they approached the cabin cautiously. Or someone who don't know this land belongs to the Triple Crown now. But it wasn't the smoke that slowed Copper's steady gait. It was the singing, high and clear, drifting through the early evening air like something from another world. A woman's voice, singing words Cade couldn't quite make out, but with a melody that seemed to reach inside his chest and squeeze. He dismounted at the edge of the small clearing, ground-tethered Copper, and drew his Colt. Not that he planned on using it, but 5 years in Montana Territory had taught him caution preceded survival. As he crept toward the cabin, the singing grew clearer, and Cade realized with a start that he recognized the tune. "Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you, away, you rolling river." The voice wavered on certain notes, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable: longing, grief, and something else Cade couldn't quite name. He edged around to the front of the cabin, avoiding the creaking porch boards he remembered from delivering supplies to old man Kendrick years back. Through the grimy window, he saw her. A young woman with rich brown hair tumbling past her shoulders, dressed in a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was meticulously mended. She moved around the cabin's single room, sweeping with purpose, singing as if her life depended on each note. "Oh, Shenandoah, I long to see you, away I'm bound away, cross the wide Missouri." Something about the way she emphasized certain words struck Cade as odd. She wasn't just singing, she was emphasizing long, sea, bound, and Missouri with peculiar intensity. As if the song itself contained a message, he holstered his pistol and moved toward the door. Whatever her story, she wasn't a threat. Just as he raised his hand to knock, the next verse froze him in place. "The white man's son made me his captive, away, you rolling river, but I escaped my prairie prison, away I'm bound away, cross the wide Missouri." Those weren't the traditional lyrics. A chill ran down his spine as he realized this was no ordinary rendition. The woman was singing her own story. He knocked firmly 3 times. The singing stopped abruptly. Silence stretched for several seconds, then footsteps approached the door. "Who's there?" Her voice was steady but wary. "Name's Cade Whitman, ma'am. I ride for Triple Crown Ranch. This property belongs to my employer now." More silence, then, "Are you alone, Mr. Whitman?" "Yes, ma'am, just me and my horse." The door opened just enough to reveal her face, and Cade found himself staring into eyes the color of summer sage. Up close, he could see she was young, perhaps 20, with a smattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks flushed from exertion or fear, he couldn't tell which. "I'm Clara Kendrick," she said. "This was my uncle's place." Cade blinked in surprise. Kendrick never mentioned family. He wouldn't have. Her eyes darted past him, scanning the surrounding landscape. "May I see your face properly, mister?" "Whitman, step back into the light, please." Something in her tone made him comply without question. He moved back, removing his hat and allowing the setting sun to illuminate his features. He knew what she'd see: a lean face weathered beyond its years, dark hair overdue for cutting, and eyes his mother had once called the color of coffee with too much milk. She studied him intently, then opened the door wider. "You'd better come in. It'll be dark soon, and they sometimes patrol at dusk." Cade asked, but she was already retreating inside, leaving him little choice but to follow. The cabin's interior was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. A small fire burned in the stone hearth, explaining the smoke that had caught his attention. Clara moved to the single window and pulled a threadbare curtain across it. "I shouldn't be here," she said without preamble. "No one can know I'm here." "Miss Kendrick, I don't understand." "Clara, please call me Clara." She took a deep breath. "I need to know if I can trust you, Mr. Whitman." "My life depends on it." Kade shifted uncomfortably. Trust wasn't something he gave or received easily anymore. "I don't make promises I can't keep." A small smile touched her lips. "That's honest at least." She gestured to the room's only chair. "Please sit, I'll explain as best I can." Kade remained standing. "I'd prefer to know what kind of trouble you're in first." Clara nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "I was taken by Broken Hands men 3 years ago during a raid on our settlement in Kansas. My parents were killed, my younger brother too." Her voice remained steady, but her fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt. "I was brought north as a prize for one of his lieutenants." Kade felt his jaw tighten. Broken Hand was notorious in the territory, a former Union soldier turned outlaw who commanded a gang of deserters and criminals. They raided settlements and preyed on travelers throughout the northern territories. "You escaped," he said, not a question. 2 weeks ago, I knew my uncle had a place up here, though I'd never visited. I've been hiding, watching for pursuit." She looked up at him, her gaze direct. "They'll kill me if they find me, Mr. Whitman, and they'll kill anyone who helps me." "Kade," he corrected automatically. "Call me Kade." A moment of silence stretched between them as the implications of her situation sank in. The law was thin in the territory. Marshals were few and far between. Even if they believed her story, they might not risk confronting Broken Hand's gang for one woman. "The song," he said suddenly, "you were singing it as a message." Clara nodded, a flicker of appreciation crossing her face. "I change the lyrics sometimes. It helps me remember who I am, where I came from, where I'm trying to go." "Missouri. My mother's family is there if I can reach them." She shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its hopelessness. "It's a long way from Montana." Kade finally took the offered chair, setting his hat on his knee. "How have you been surviving out here?" "My uncle kept a garden, some of it still producing. There are wild berries." "I set snares," her chin lifted slightly. "I wasn't raised helpless." "Clearly not." Kade found himself oddly impressed. Most people wouldn't survive 2 weeks alone in this wilderness, let alone a young woman being hunted by outlaws. "But winter's coming, you can't stay here." "I know." Her shoulders slumped slightly. "I just needed somewhere to gather my strength, plan my next move." Kade's thoughts raced. The responsible thing would be to report her presence to his boss, Jason Hargrove. The Triple Crown's owner was a fair man, but he'd likely insist on involving the territorial authorities. That could mean word spreading about Clara's whereabouts, or Kade could simply ride away, pretend he'd never found her. Let her fate remain in her own hands. Both options left a bitter taste in his mouth. "I should go," he said abruptly, rising. "It'll be full dark soon." Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. I won't tell anyone I found you," he added. "But Miss Kendrick, Clara, you should know that riders from Triple Crown patrol these boundaries regularly. You might not be so lucky next time." "I understand." She walked him to the door. "Thank you for your discretion, Kade." He nodded once and stepped onto the porch, settling his hat back on his head. The first stars were appearing overhead, the mountains to the west now dark silhouettes against the indigo sky. "That song," he said, not looking back at her, "my mother used to sing it." He could feel her waiting behind him, silent. "I'll be back tomorrow," he heard himself saying. "I'll bring supplies." "Why would you risk that?" Her voice was barely audible. Kade turned then, meeting her gaze in the gathering darkness. "Because 5 years ago, I was the only survivor when raiders hit our homestead. Nobody helped me either." Without waiting for her response, he strode toward Copper. The dun gelding nickered softly as Kade swung into the saddle and turned toward the Triple Crown's main house, 7 miles distant. He told himself he was just being decent, that anyone would help a woman in such circumstances. But as he rode through the deepening night, the melody of Shenandoah played in his mind, and for the first time in years, Kade Whitman felt something crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Clara Kendrick watched the cowboy disappear into the darkness, her heart pounding. For 2 weeks, she'd hidden from every human sound, every distant hoofbeat. Now she'd revealed her presence and her story to a complete stranger. Either she'd just signed her death warrant or she'd found an unexpected ally. She closed and barred the door, moving mechanically through her evening routine. Bank the fire, check the window shutters, arrange her meager bedding near the hearth. Her mind remained fixed on Kade Whitman's parting words. Nobody helped me either. She recognized the look in his eyes, the same haunted shadow she saw in her own reflection in the small shard of mirror she'd found among her uncle's belongings. The look of someone who had survived when others hadn't, who carried that burden every day. Clara curled beneath her thin blanket, staring at the dying embers. She couldn't afford to trust him completely, not yet. But for the first time since her escape, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Kade returned the next afternoon as promised, his saddlebags bulging with supplies, flour, coffee, salt pork, and ammunition for the ancient rifle she'd found in her uncle's trunk. He worked quickly, chopping enough firewood to last a week, patching the worst leaks in the roof and reinforcing the door. "I told Hargrove I'm checking the north boundary fences," he explained as he worked. "It gives me a reason to be out this way every few days." Clara watched him from where she sat cleaning the rifle. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." Kade paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the October chill. "Maybe I'm tired of just surviving," he said finally. "Maybe helping you feels like something worth doing." It became their pattern. Every third day, Kade would appear with supplies or news. Clara began to measure time by his visits, finding herself listening for hoofbeats throughout the day when she expected him. On his fourth visit, he brought her a newspaper from Helena. "Thought you might want to know what's happening in the world," he said, handing her the folded pages. "There's a stage line starting up between here and Kansas City. Runs once a month through the winter." Clara's fingers tightened on the paper. "You think I could take it to Missouri?" Kade shrugged. "It's dangerous. Stages get held up, but it's faster than trying to walk and less noticeable than traveling alone." "I'd need money," she said softly. "And proper clothes and papers." "We'll figure it out." The ease with which he included himself in her plans didn't escape either of them. That evening, as the early winter sunset painted the mountains gold and crimson, Clara sang while preparing the rabbit stew Kade had brought. This time she sang the traditional lyrics to Shenandoah, her voice growing stronger with each verse. Kade listened from where he sat mending a tear in her shawl, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft with the needle. When she finished, he looked up with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You have a beautiful voice," he said simply. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "My mother taught me. We used to sing together while working." "My mother too," he returned to his mending. "She said music made hard times easier to bear." She was right. Clara stirred the stew, watching him from the corner of her eye. In just 2 weeks, Kade Whitman had transformed from a potential threat to the center of her fragile world. His visits were islands of safety in her sea of fear. "Would you sing with me sometime?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Been a long time since I sang anything." "All the more reason to start again." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxing of the perpetual tension in his jaw. "Maybe," he conceded. "Someday." Later, as Kade prepared to leave, Clara impulsively caught his hand. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." His fingers tightened briefly around hers, the touch sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. "I'll be back in 3 days," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. "Stay safe, Clara." She watched him ride away, the familiar ache of solitude settling over her like a physical weight. Only now it was accompanied by a new sensation, anticipation of his return. Kade couldn't pinpoint exactly when protecting Clara had evolved into something more complicated. Perhaps it was the evening she taught him to dance in the cramped cabin, humming a waltz while they awkwardly navigated the limited space. Or maybe during the afternoon they'd spotted a herd of elk from the ridge behind the cabin, and he'd seen childlike wonder transform her face. Whenever it had happened, Kade now found himself counting the hours between visits, inventing increasingly elaborate excuses to be away from the Triple Crown for longer periods. The boundary fences had never received such thorough attention. November brought the first heavy snowfall, blanketing the landscape and making travel between the ranch and Clara's cabin more difficult. Cade began staying overnight, sleeping on a pallet near the door while Clara took the narrow bed he'd helped construct from salvaged wood. Their evenings fell into a comfortable routine. They would share a simple meal, then talk by firelight. Clara told him about her childhood in Kansas, her parents' small farm, her brother's mischievous streak. Cade gradually shared his own stories, his father's determination to carve a homestead from the unforgiving Montana prairie, his mother's garden that somehow thrived despite harsh conditions, his sister's skill with horses. Neither of them spoke much about the attacks that had shattered their families. Those memories remained too raw, too sacred for casual conversation. But the shared understanding of that specific grief created a bond between them that deepened with each passing day. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside the cabin walls, Clara finally asked the question Cade had been dreading. What will happen when spring comes? They sat before the fire, Clara mending one of the shirts he'd brought her, Cade cleaning his revolver with practiced movements. You'll be able to travel then, he answered carefully. The stage runs more frequently after the thaw. That's not what I meant, she said, her sewing aside. What will happen to us? Cade kept his eyes on his work, though his hands had stilled. There isn't an us, Clara, I'm just helping you. Is that truly all this is to you? Her voice remained steady, but he heard the hurt beneath it. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze across the small space between them. What else could it be? You're running for your life. I'm a ranch hand with nothing to offer except a few supplies and some company. That's not true. Clara moved to kneel beside his chair, her hand coming to rest on his forearm. You've given me hope, Cade. You've reminded me that there's still goodness in this world. The warmth of her touch seemed to burn through his shirt sleeve. You deserve better than a life on the run, he said roughly. Better than looking over your shoulder, wondering if today's the day broken hands men find you. I deserve to choose my own path. Her eyes, those sage-green eyes that haunted his dreams, held his without wavering. And I'm choosing to believe that there might be a future for us, somewhere. Cade felt something crack inside him, the final fissure in the wall he'd built after burying his family. He reached out, touching her cheek with tentative fingers. I don't know how to protect you if you stay, he admitted. And I don't know how to let you go. Clara turned her face into his palm. Then we'll figure it out together. The kiss that followed was gentle, hesitant, a question and an answer both. When they pulled apart, Cade rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of pine soap and wood smoke that had become Clara's signature. I never expected to find you, he whispered. I never expected to be found, she replied, a smile in her voice. Yet here we are. That night, Cade still slept on his pallet by the door. But something fundamental had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither had dared consider before. The blizzard lasted 3 days, trapping them in the cabin together. They passed the time with stories, songs, and planning. Clara's determination to reach Missouri remained firm, but now they spoke of after she connected with her mother's family, after she established her safety. After she could stop looking over her shoulder. On the 4th day, the storm cleared, revealing a world transformed by snow. Cade reluctantly prepared to return to the Triple Crown. They'll be wondering what happened to me, he explained as he saddled Copper, who seemed equally reluctant to leave the shelter of the linta they'd constructed for him. When will you return? Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in the quilt from her bed. Soon as I can, he promised, 2 days at most. She nodded, her expression solemn. Be careful on the trail. The snow will show your tracks clearly. The reminder of danger sobered them both. Cade mounted Copper, adjusting his scarf against the biting cold. Bar the door behind me, he instructed. Don't open it for anyone but me. I know, she managed a smile. I've survived this long, haven't I? He tipped his hat to her. That you have, Miss Kendrick, that you have. Cade rode away with the unsettling feeling that something was ending, though he couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that their idyllic isolation couldn't last forever. Winter would eventually yield to spring, and decisions would have to be made. His unease only grew when he reached the Triple Crown and found Jason Hargrove waiting for him, expression grave. Where the hell have you been, Whitman? The rancher demanded. 3 days with no word. Caught in the blizzard, Cade replied truthfully. Holed up in that line shack on the north boundary. Hargrove studied him for a long moment. There's been trouble. Riders spotted near Palmer Creek 2 days ago. Didn't recognize them, but they were asking questions about the old Kendrick place. Kade felt his blood turn to ice. What kind of questions? Whether anyone had seen smoke from that direction, whether the property was occupied. Hargrove's shrewd eyes narrowed. Anything you want to tell me, Whitman? Kade hesitated. Hargrove was a fair employer, respected throughout the territory, but the fewer people who knew about Clara, the safer she would be. Just making sure our boundary fences are secure, he said finally. That's all. Hargrove didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly. Well, keep your eyes open. Those riders didn't look friendly, and I don't want trouble with the neighbors. Yes, sir. Kade turned toward the bunkhouse, his mind racing. He needed to warn Clara. If Broken Hand's men were searching for her, they were running out of time. Clara knew something was wrong the moment Kade appeared the next morning, riding hard through the fresh snow, his expression grim. They're looking for you, he said without preamble as he dismounted. Men were asking about this cabin a few days ago. Fear, her constant companion for so long, surged through her veins. How close? Palmer Creek. About 15 miles south. Kade paced the small cabin. We need to move you now. Clara took a deep breath, forcing down panic. Where? The stage doesn't come through for another 2 weeks. I've been thinking about that. Kade stopped pacing, turning to face her. There's a mining settlement called Prosperity about 40 miles west of here. Small, mostly decent folks. The owner of the boarding house there, Widow Johnson, she might take you in if I vouch for you. And then what? Clara asked quietly. Hide until the stage comes. Hope Broken Hand's men don't find me there too. Kade ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as frustration. I don't have all the answers, Clara. I'm just trying to keep you alive. She crossed to him, taking his cold hands between her warmer ones. I know, I'm sorry, she squeezed his fingers. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. First light, he squeezed her hands in return. Pack only what you absolutely need. We'll travel light and fast. They spent the day preparing. Clara gathered her meager belongings while Kade prepared the horses, Copper for himself, and a gentle bay mare named Daisy that he'd borrowed from the Triple Crown's remuda. Hargrove will understand once I explain, he said when Clara expressed concern about the borrowed horse. And if he doesn't, well, I've been thinking about moving on anyway. The casualness with which he referenced potentially giving up his livelihood for her safety didn't escape Clara's notice. As they worked side by side, she found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The careful precision of his movements, the quiet competence in everything he did, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he caught her watching him. In just over a month, this man had become her world. The thought of losing him terrified her almost as much as the prospect of being recaptured. That evening, as they sat before the fire sharing what might be their last meal in the cabin, Clara finally voiced the question that had been haunting her. What if they find us on the trail tomorrow? Kade looked up from his coffee, his expression solemn. I won't let them take you. You can't promise that, she said gently. Broken Hand travels with at least 6 men from what I've heard. Then we'll make sure they don't find us, he set his cup aside. Clara, I need you to promise me something. She nodded, sensing the gravity in his tone. If something happens tomorrow, if we're separated, or if I tell you to run, you go. You don't wait for me. You don't come back for me. You ride for Prosperity and find Widow Johnson. Kade, promise me, his voice was rough with emotion. I can face anything tomorrow except the thought of you being taken again. Clara swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. I promise, she whispered, but you must promise something in return. Promise you'll be careful. Promise you'll find me afterward. The smile he gave her then was both tender and sad. I promise to try my damnedest. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Clara made a decision. Setting aside propriety and caution, she crossed to where Kade was arranging his pallet by the door. Not tonight, she said simply, holding out her hand. Tonight, stay with me. The surprise in his eyes gave way to understanding as he took her offered hand and allowed her to lead him to the narrow bed they'd built together. That night they shared not just the small bed but their hearts, their bodies, their dreams of a future that suddenly seemed both more possible and more precarious than ever before. In the quiet afterward, as Clara lay in the circle of Cade's arms, she felt him press a kiss to her hair. "I love you," he murmured, so softly she almost thought she'd imagined it. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that." Clara tightened her arms around him, memorizing the feel of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. "And I love you. We'll find our way through this." They fell asleep holding each other, the fire burning low in the hearth, while outside the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the fears and hopes of the two people sheltered below. Dawn broke clear and cold. They were on the trail before the sun fully cleared the eastern mountains, Clara riding Daisy, Cade on Copper. They traveled in silence, alert for any sound that didn't belong to the winter forest. Their plan was simple. Follow game trails through the foothills rather than the main road, ford the river at its shallowest point, then cut northwest toward Prosperity. With luck, they would arrive by nightfall. The first few hours passed without incident. The snow-covered landscape was beautiful in the morning light, trees draped in white, animal tracks crisscrossing their path. Despite the danger, Clara found herself appreciating these moments, riding beside Cade, facing whatever came together. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horses and eat some jerky and hard biscuits. Cade seemed increasingly tense, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "What is it?" Clara asked as they prepared to mount up again. Not sure, he adjusted Copper's saddle, just a feeling. They had just reached the river when Cade suddenly reined in, raising a hand for silence. Clara pulled Daisy to a halt beside him, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. Then she heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast. "Get across," Cade ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Clara urged Daisy into the shallow ford, the mare picking her way carefully across the slick river rocks. Cade followed close behind, both of them scanning the tree line they'd just left. They had almost reached the far bank when 5 riders burst from the trees, their shouts carrying across the water. "There she is." "Get her." Clara recognized the lead rider instantly, Luther Reed, Broken Hand's lieutenant and the man she'd been given to as a prize. His face, scarred from an old knife wound that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer, was burned into her nightmares. "Run," Cade shouted, drawing his revolver. "Clara, go." She hesitated for just a moment, torn between her promise and her desperate desire not to leave him. Then Daisy scrambled up the far bank and training took over. Clara dug her heels into the mare's sides, urging her into a gallop along the riverbank. Behind her she heard gunshots, 1, 2, 3 in rapid succession, then shouts and the splash of horses entering the river. She didn't look back, focusing only on the path ahead and the desperate need to put distance between herself and her pursuers. She rode hard for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. Daisy, sensing her rider's fear, gave everything she had, hooves pounding over the frozen ground. Eventually, Clara risked a glance over her shoulder. One rider was in pursuit, gaining steadily on her. The others were nowhere to be seen. Had Cade stopped them, was he? She couldn't complete the thought, wouldn't allow herself to imagine the worst. Instead, she urged Daisy toward a stand of dense pines, hoping to lose her pursuer among the trees. The mare was tiring, her breath coming in great steaming clouds. Clara knew they couldn't outrun the fresher horse behind them much longer. She needed a plan. The trees provided temporary cover. Clara guided Daisy deeper into the pine forest, listening intently for sounds of pursuit. When she heard the crackle of branches behind her, she made her decision. Sliding from the saddle, she slapped Daisy's flank, sending the mare trotting forward while Clara concealed herself behind a massive pine trunk. She drew the small revolver Cade had given her, checking that all 6 chambers were loaded. Her hands shook slightly, but her resolve was iron. She would not be taken again, not alive. The rider approached cautiously, his horse moving at a walk now. Clara held her breath as he passed her hiding place, his attention focused on Daisy's retreating form ahead. It wasn't Luther Reed but one of his men, a younger outlaw she remembered being called Fletch. She stepped out, revolver raised. "Stop right there." Fletch jerked around in his saddle, surprise evident on his face. Before he could react, Clara fired. The shot went wide, but it spooked his horse, which reared suddenly. Fletch, caught off guard, tumbled from the saddle with a shout. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired again as he scrambled for his own weapon. This time her bullet found its mark, striking his shoulder. Fletch howled in pain, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. "Where is Cade?" she demanded, advancing on him, keeping the revolver leveled at his chest. Fletch glared up at her, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "That cowboy, probably dead by now. Reed and the boys were dealing with him when I took off after you." Cold dread washed over her, but Clara kept her expression neutral. "How many men does Broken Hand have with him?" "Just us 5, Fletch grimaced. "Been tracking you for weeks, saw smoke from the cabin a few days back. Reed was real happy about that." Clara's mind raced. 5 men, including Fletch, if Cade had managed to hold off the other 4 at the river. A gunshot echoed through the trees, followed by another. They were close, too close. Fletch's lips curved into a malicious grin. "Sounds like they're coming for you," he taunted. "Reed's been promising all kinds of pain when he catches you. Says you need to learn respect." Clara stepped closer, her fingers steady on the trigger. "I'm not going back." "You ain't got a choice," Fletch spat. "Even if you kill me, the others will run you down. You got nowhere to go." Another shot closer still. Clara made her decision. "Get up," she ordered, slowly. Fletch struggled to his feet, still clutching his wounded shoulder. "What are you gonna do? Shoot me in cold blood?" "If I have to," Clara gestured with the revolver. "Call your horse." Fletch hesitated, then whistled sharply. His mount, which had stopped several yards away, perked its ears and approached cautiously. "Now what?" Fletch asked, eyeing her warily. Clara kept the gun trained on him. "Now you're going to help me find Cade." Kade Whitman knew he was in trouble the moment he saw the riders emerge from the tree line. 5 of them, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of predators. The one in front, with the scarred face, had fixed his gaze on Clara with such malevolent intensity that Cade had felt it like a physical blow. "Run!" he'd shouted, drawing his Colt and firing at the approaching riders, hoping to buy her time to escape. His first shot caught one of the men in the chest, sending him tumbling from his saddle. The others returned fire as they splashed into the river, bullets kicking up water around Copper's legs. Cade fired again, then urged his gelding up the bank, intending to follow Clara. But the scarred man, Reed, he presumed, and 2 others were already closing the distance. The 4th rider had broken away, pursuing Clara along the riverbank. Cade fired again, aiming for Reed, but his shot went wide. A searing pain tore through his left side as one of the outlaw's bullets found its mark. Cade gasped, nearly losing his seat as Copper reared in panic. He managed to stay mounted, but the momentary distraction cost him. Reed and another outlaw flanked him, cutting off his escape route. "That's far enough, cowboy," Reed called, his gun aimed steadily at Cade's chest. "Toss the Colt or the next one goes through your head." Cade calculated his odds, 3 against 1, and he was already wounded. If he died here, Clara would have no one looking for her. Reluctantly, he dropped his revolver. "Smart move," Reed said, though his expression suggested he'd have preferred resistance. "Off the horse, hands where I can see them." Cade dismounted carefully, his side burning with each movement. Blood soaked his shirt beneath his coat, but he kept his expression neutral. Show no weakness. That had been his father's rule on the frontier. The 2 outlaws who hadn't pursued Clara closed in, one covering Cade with a shotgun while the other patted him down, removing his knife from his boot. "Where's the girl headed?" Reed asked, still mounted on his big black gelding. "Don't know what you're talking about," Cade replied evenly. Reed's twisted mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "Playing it that way are we," he nodded to the man with the shotgun. "Teach him some manners, Joe." The shotgun barrel swung in a vicious arc, catching Cade across the temple. Pain exploded behind his eyes as he dropped to his knees in the snow. Before he could recover, a boot connected with his wounded side, sending him sprawling. "Let's try again," Reed said conversationally. "Where is Clara Kendrick going?" Cade spat blood onto the pristine snow. "Go to hell." What followed was a methodical beating, calculated to cause pain without immediate unconsciousness. Through it all, Cade remained silent, focusing on one thought. Every minute Reed spent on him was another minute Clara had to escape. Finally, Reed signaled a halt. Joe and the other outlaw stepped back, breathing heavily from their exertions. Cade lay curled on his side in the blood-stained snow, fighting to remain conscious. "Stubborn bastard," Reed observed, dismounting at last. He crouched beside Cade, grabbing a handful of his hair to force his head up. "She's not worth dying for, cowboy. She belongs to me. Property, understand, but you tell me where she's headed, and maybe I let you crawl away from here." Cade met his gaze, summoning the strength to speak. She doesn't belong to anyone, he managed. Especially not a coward who preys on women. Reed's expression darkened. He released Cade's hair, letting his head fall back to the snow. Standing, he drew his revolver and aimed it at Cade's head. Guess we don't need you after all. Fletch will bring her back soon enough. A shot rang out, startling birds from the nearby trees. Reed staggered, a look of surprise crossing his scarred features as his gun hand jerked upward, his shot going wide. Blood bloomed on his upper arm. Next one goes through your heart, called a voice Cade recognized instantly. Clara. She emerged from the trees on the opposite bank, Fletch stumbling ahead of her with his hands raised, her revolver pressed to his back. Behind them came a rider Cade didn't recognize, a man in a marshal's coat. U.S. Marshal James Bennett, the newcomer announced, his rifle trained on Reed and his men. Drop your weapons, all of you. For a moment, no one moved. Then Reed began to laugh, an ugly, grating sound. Well, look at that. The little bird found herself a lawman. His eyes narrowed as he studied the marshal. Been a while, Bennett. Thought you were patrolling up near the Canadian border these days. Special assignment, Bennett replied coolly. Been tracking you since that stagecoach robbery near Fort Benton. Didn't expect to find you here, but I'm not complaining. Reed's calculating gaze shifted between Clara, Cade, and the marshal. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his revolver, then suddenly swung it toward Clara. Two shots cracked almost simultaneously. Reed jerked backward, blood blossoming on his chest from the marshal's bullet. But it was Clara's shot that had found the more lethal mark, striking Reed squarely between the eyes. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, quickly surrendered, dropping their weapons into the snow. Marshal Bennett dismounted, covering them while Clara rushed to Cade's side. Cade, her hands were gentle as they turned him onto his back. Oh God, what did they do to you? He managed a weak smile, reaching up to touch her face. You came back, he murmured. I told you to run. I did run, she replied, tears welling in her eyes, straight into Marshal Bennett. He was tracking these men already. She pressed her hand against the wound in his side, trying to stem the bleeding. Stay with me, Cade, please. Marshal Bennett appeared beside them, his weathered face concerned as he assessed Cade's injuries. We need to get him somewhere warm. How far to the nearest settlement? Prosperity, Cade gasped. About 20 miles northwest. Bennett nodded, too far in his condition. He looked at Clara. That cabin you mentioned, how far back is it? 7 miles, maybe 8, she said. We can make it before dark if we hurry. Go with them, Fletch suddenly spoke up from where he sat guarding the other outlaws. I'll stay here with these 3 until you send help. Bennett hesitated, then nodded. If any of them are missing when I get back, I'll hold you personally responsible. Understood, Marshal. Fletch's expression was grim but determined. I owe her that much, he added, nodding toward Clara. Bennett helped get Cade onto Copper, then mounted his own horse, taking the reins while Cade leaned forward against the gelding's neck, clinging to consciousness. Clara rode beside them on Daisy, her eyes rarely leaving Cade's slumped form. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of pain and cold for Cade. He drifted in and out of awareness, anchored only by Clara's voice as she spoke to him constantly, urging him to stay awake, to keep fighting. By the time they reached the cabin, twilight was gathering. Bennett and Clara helped Cade inside, laying him on the bed. While the marshal built up the fire, Clara heated water and gathered clean cloths. The bullet went through, she reported after examining the wound in his side. Clean, thankfully, but he's lost a lot of blood. Bennett nodded grimly. Do what you can for him tonight. I'll ride for Prosperity at first light, bring back the doctor and men to collect those outlaws. Through the haze of pain, Cade watched as Clara efficiently cleaned and bandaged his wounds, her touch gentle yet sure. The beating had left its marks, bruised ribs, a split lip, a gash along his hairline, but it was the bullet wound that concerned her most. You shouldn't have come back, he said when Bennett had stepped outside to check on the horses. Clara paused in her ministrations, meeting his gaze steadily. I made a promise to find you afterward, she reminded him. I keep my promises, Kade Whitman. Despite the pain, he felt a smile tug at his lips. So you do, he caught her hand, bringing it to his lips despite the effort it cost him. Thank you. She leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. Rest now. I'll be right here. As exhaustion pulled him towards sleep, Cade held onto that promise like a lifeline. Clara would be there when he woke. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream of a future beyond mere survival. Spring came gently to the Montana Territory that year. The snow retreated gradually from the valleys, wildflowers appearing in its wake. At the Triple Crown Ranch, preparations for the spring roundup were underway, though one familiar face was missing from the bunkhouse. Kade Whitman stood on the porch of the small cabin he'd spent the winter rebuilding, watching as a wagon approached along the newly cleared road. Recovery from his wounds had been slow but steady, aided by Clara's unwavering care and the support of unexpected allies. Jason Hargrove had arrived at the cabin the day after the confrontation with Reed's gang, accompanying the doctor from Prosperity and Marshall Bennett. Far from being angry about the borrowed horse or Cade's deception, the rancher had offered something neither Cade nor Clara had dared hope for: legitimate claim to the Kendrick homestead. Land's technically part of the Triple Crown now, Hargrove had explained. But I've got more than I can manage as it is. You two want to work it, make something of it. I'm willing to sell it back for a fair price. In the months that followed, word of Clara's ordeal and her part in bringing down Broken Hand's notorious gang spread throughout the territory. What might have been a scandal, a young woman living alone with a man not her husband, was instead met with respect and a frontier pragmatism that recognized courage and resilience when it saw it. The wagon drew closer, and Cade smiled as he recognized its occupants. Marshall Bennett, now a regular visitor, and beside him, the circuit preacher who served the scattered settlements in this part of the territory. Clara appeared in the doorway behind Cade, a question in her eyes as she spotted the approaching wagon. "Is that Reverend Taylor?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I wasn't expecting him until next week." Cade turned to face her, suddenly nervous despite weeks of planning. "I might have asked him to come today specifically." Clara tilted her head, studying his face. "Kade Whitman, what are you up to?" Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn velvet box, his mother's, one of the few treasures he'd saved from the ruins of his family's homestead. "I had a whole speech planned," he said as Clara's eyes widened in recognition, "about how you taught me that surviving isn't the same as living, about how your song called to me that day, even before I knew what it meant." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "But all I really need to say is that I love you, Clara Kendrick. Will you marry me today?" Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from the ring to his face. "Today." Cade nodded toward the approaching wagon. "Reverend Taylor is here." Marshall Bennett agreed to stand as witness. "Unless you'd prefer to wait, plan a proper wedding." "No," she interrupted, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. "Today is perfect. Yes, Cade, yes, I'll marry you today." The ceremony took place that afternoon on the porch of what was now truly their home. Clara wore her best dress, adorned with wildflowers she and Cade had gathered that morning. Marshall Bennett stood proud as witness, while Reverend Taylor performed the simple frontier ceremony with dignity and warmth. As they spoke their vows, Cade thought of that October evening when he'd first heard Clara's voice drifting from the supposedly empty cabin. How that song, laden with hidden meaning, had called to something in his soul he'd thought long dead. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Taylor declared, beaming at the young couple. "Mr. Whitman, you may kiss your bride." Cade gathered Clara gently into his arms, mindful of his still-healing ribs. As their lips met, sealing their vows, he heard her whisper against his mouth, "Thank you for finding me." "Thank you for singing," he whispered back. Later, after the Reverend and Marshall had departed with promises to return for Sunday services, Cade and Clara stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. "What shall we name it?" Clara asked, leaning against his shoulder. "The ranch, I mean." Cade considered for a moment, then smiled. "How about Shenandoah, after the song that brought us together?" Clara laughed, the sound still the sweetest music he'd ever heard. "Shenandoah Ranch, I like it." She turned in his arms, her expression growing thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever make it to Missouri, to see my mother's family?" "Someday," he promised. "We'll take the stage east, introduce ourselves properly, but for now." "For now we're home," she finished, rising on tiptoe to kiss him again. As twilight settled over the Montana landscape, Cade Whitman held his wife close, savoring the peace they'd found together. The cabin was no longer empty, and Clara's songs were no longer messages of desperation, but celebrations of the life they were building. In finding each other, they had both found something they'd thought lost forever. Not just love, but hope, purpose, and the courage to dream beyond mere survival. And as the first stars appeared overhead, Clara began to sing softly, the familiar melody of Shenandoah rising into the evening air. Only now the lyrics spoke not of longing and separation, but of homecoming and love that had crossed a different kind of rolling river. The river of loss and pain that had nearly swept them both away, before they'd found each other on the far shore.